Good news, everyone! After a decade of waiting, Final Fantasy XIV finally has a release date! And isn't it about f***ing time? But wait, no, it's not just a release date. They're also making a short anime series and a complete CGI movie. Wow, they are really putting all their eggs into one basket on this one, aren't they? If they want to survive as a company, they better be praying that this is successful. After all, everyone does realize that the potential for Final Fantasy XV failing is the exact reason they're creating the Final Fantasy VII reimagining now as opposed to at another date, right? They've wasted so much time and money on Final Fantasy XV that they can't possibly hope to make enough profit off of it. Hell, at this point, I'll be surprised if they even break even. Now, that isn't to say that Final Fantasy XV won't be successful. Actually, I know it'll be successful, even if it's awful. People have been waiting so long and are so hyped for it that it will sell an astronomical amount of units. I just don't know that it'll be enough to make up for the costs. Anyway, coming back from my little tangent, Square Enix also released a brand new demo for Final Fantasy XV called the Platinum Demo. As a longtime Final Fantasy fan that's played every English release Final Fantasy title ever, I figured I'd take this time to dissect the demos, and share my thoughts on whether or not I think Final Fantasy XV will be a decent entry in the series. Let's begin with the first release demo, shall we? Episode Duske. The game's first demo was a vertical slice, so to speak, showing what we can actually expect from the final experience. And I have to admit outright that when I first played this demo, day one with the English release of Type 0 HD, I was far from impressed. The clunky combat controls that had me holding down the attack and or invincibility button to win every battle without any real skill was a huge turnoff, especially considering how brilliantly challenging the combat in Type 0 turned out to be. Upon revisiting the demo for this video, I was set to tear into it and list all the reasons I am not looking forward to this game. But god damn it. It slowly began to win me over, mostly thanks to the 2.0 update Square introduced to the demo. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's phenomenal by any means. In fact, at best I think the game will be a slightly above average product in terms of quality if this demo is truly representative of it. But slightly above average is far better than the miserable heap of trash I'd remembered it being. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough. Let's break this down into a proper critique, shall we? The first and most obvious thing players are going to notice about Duske is how beautiful it is. I'm happy to see that it remains colorful in comparison to a lot of the Western offerings that have dominated the market in recent years. Now don't get me wrong, I enjoy the more realistic and gritty look in those other games when the story and setting call for it, but I'm glad Final Fantasy is sticking a bit more to its roots in this regard when it comes to its environments. On the other hand, I'm not exactly fond of the character design. For starters, all of the characters are dressed completely in black, and while that sounds like a stupid and nitpicky complaint on the surface, it does actually pose a bigger problem. In visual mediums, character design is used to tell you things about said character. The choice to have the main cast all dressed largely the same really leaves the characters feeling like they aren't at all unique to one another. Generally speaking, having characters dress in uniforms is meant to show a sign of unity and conformism, but in this case, they're dressed like a boy band. I mean, the whole uniform aspect worked in Final Fantasy Type 0 because all of the characters were from the same military, and, well, there are other spoilery reasons for it too, but here these are supposed to be just friends, not metaphorical clones of one another. Even more than that, I have a problem with how the characters are represented in this world, and that is mostly because things clash so much with one another. This game has character designer Tetsuya Nomura's signatures all over it, with the pointed hair and stylish Japanese pop-inspired clothing for the heroes, which in itself I suppose is fine if you're into that sort of thing, but the problem is, no one else in the world dresses like this. You walk your characters up to a gas station and see everyone else wearing regular t-shirts and jeans. I mean, yes, in the real world, not everyone can afford top-of-the-line clothing brands, but when your party walks up to a gas station dressed like a boy band while all the other people in the world are wearing normal t-shirts, jeans, and branded convenience store attire, your party looks out of place, not the world around you, and I find that distracting. It felt even more cringeworthy when I walked up to a group of talking about how much they want to bang the scantily clad mechanic. Things felt a bit too real for me here. Now, I'm not saying this type of commentary should be avoided entirely in the realm of video games, but it certainly doesn't feel like the type of thing I'd be experiencing in a Final Fantasy title. I know this may seem captious, and I'm having a bit of trouble expressing why it bothers me so much on this small of a scale, but it leads into a larger potential problem that this setting could have in terms of not feeling consistent or like it even exists. Now, let's be honest and talk about the elephant in the room here. We all know what they're going for. You'd have to be blind to not realize that Square is trying to recapture the aesthetic of Final Fantasy VII, and this is actually a bigger issue than it may seem like on the surface. I've yet to see any game recreate or mimic the style of Final Fantasy VII's type of setting well, and I'd like to see that uniqueness re-explored, but I'm skeptical as to whether or not that type of setting can properly be re-explored, especially with this type of game and in the current gaming market. It becomes an obvious issue when you realize that the complete mishmash of super futuristic cities, rural farmhouses, and ancient temples that permeated Final Fantasy VII's world is so incoherent that it almost feels like they didn't have a plan for the setting at all to begin with and never aimed for any type of consistency in the world building anyway. Let's face it, back then, before realism was the standard, that kind of over-the-top creativity and surrealism was not only the norm, but not really given a second glance. And I don't know if that will still be acceptable to the gaming community as it stands now, because with realistic presentation comes a much steeper barrier for suspension of disbelief. I bring this up because it's actually not the first time Final Fantasy has had this problem. In fact, the last time it really occurred was in Final Fantasy VIII. While many of the completely contrived story elements in that title would have flown by without a second glance in the earlier and less realistic entries of the series, such as the hilariously awful orphanage scene for those of you who have played the game and know what I'm talking about, the very fact that they shot for a realistic look, feel, and tone in that entry made that particular section of the game feel all the more ridiculous and immersion-shattering. That's not to say that the world can't be fantastical, but the more realistic things get in terms of presentation and the more fantasy elements you put into your story, the harder you have to work to make things feel plausible, and that is generally done by creating a very specific and clearly defined set of rules for your world and then remaining consistent with them, which, so far, Final Fantasy XV seems to have no consistency whatsoever. I will admit that this does leave me a bit conflicted, however. The willingness to be absurd and create this strange combination of settings that don't seem to make logical sense is exactly what has me the most intrigued about the presentation of the setting. A world where cars and chocobos are used almost interchangeably makes no sense, and I kind of want to explore that reality for that very reason, to see how the society actually functions in all facets. Though, I don't know if I trust the writers and developers at Square to actually delve into that side of the lore all that much in-game. At least, not without a whole bunch of glossaries, but I digress. As far as the graphical presentation goes beyond that, the poor frame rate is completely unacceptable, and isn't even the type of thing I generally pay that much attention to. The game skips frames regularly, and while that doesn't affect the gameplay most of the time because the combat is fairly automated, it is still unfortunate and knock against the game's presentation. Now, this is where I'm going to get a lot of hate. That is, if I haven't lost you already. I'm sad to say that when it comes to the music, I am very biased at this point. Yoko Shimomura is a composer that I'm falling more and more out of love with, because frankly, I don't think she is all that talented, or more specifically, she's not all that versatile. As someone who has heard her music often, not just in her popular works like Kingdom Hearts, but in pretty much every game she's ever worked on, I've come to despise how familiar it all sounds. Her music relies on very formulaic motifs that sound pleasant at first, but they can all be used interchangeably. I reviewed the entire Mana series last year, and upon playing Legend of Mana, a game she composed in its entirety, I could literally take the music from that game, splice it into Kingdom Hearts, and it would make absolutely no difference. Here are a few examples to see if you can sympathize with my point at least a little bit. Her music is tedious to the point where I'm no longer impressed at all, and even with only 4 hours of gameplay under my belt, I already despise the main battle theme of Final Fantasy XV, which is a problem I've never before experienced with the series. Even in Final Fantasy XIII, a game where I admittedly got bored of the music, I still didn't hate it the way I do the music in this demo. At least in Kingdom Hearts, the tracks are broken up by modified Disney staples, thus keeping things from getting too monotonous, but I fear her stylings will not be suitable to an open-world game such as this, where you'll be stuck listening to the same music ad nauseum. As I said before, I know this is completely a biased bias on my part, and admittedly the songs are serviceable and catchy enough that I can see why others would enjoy them, but I can't listen to any of the compositions without thinking of at least 10 other songs she's written that sound exactly the same. That really hampered the experience for me, especially when one of the biggest draws of the Final Fantasy series for me and many others is generally the stellar soundtracks. It's also a depressing realization considering she used to be one of my favorite music composers of all time, but anyway, I guess I should move on. The only other part of the presentation I can comment on is the voice acting, which I found to be decent overall. I did play the game in English, as it's what I've come to expect from the Final Fantasy series, and old habits die hard. The cast for the demo is filled with Final Fantasy staples we've heard before, but I was able to look past that as the delivery was believable and seemed to fit the characters.
If only somebody hadn't wrecked the car. God, unbelievable.
Oh, I would hate to be that guy. Oh, come on, don't be that way. You know I didn't mean to do it.
Of course not. Sabotage is far beyond you. It's futile.
Rise and shine, princess.
Tremors. Now you did it.
Just call me Titan.
Morning there, buddy.
Eyes open.
And he's up.
Not technically up.
Not technically having our automobile repaired and heading to Corthus, then?
No turning back now, Your Highness. Gotta pay his enormousness a visit.
Even if said characters are as bland of archetypes as you could possibly imagine, but more on that later. The most entertaining thing about the dialogue in this title was the banter that happened randomly throughout the demo, and I feel that I enjoyed this mostly because it reminded me of the last story. Ah, Square. Stealing ideas from the creator of Final Fantasy even after he's left your company. Have you no shame? All joking aside, I do have issues with the presentation clearly, but the final product would likely meet the standard Square has set over the years. The game would likely look and sound amazing once it is released, but production values are never a problem for Square. Their make or break moments always fall into story and gameplay categories. Speaking of which... obviously this is just a demo and I was expecting very little in terms of story here, so don't think I'm deluded enough to do a plot analysis. While the demo does have a short arc about hunting a behemoth for car repair money, the demo's main motivation really is to make you fall in love with its characters, which is interesting given how little depth they seem to have. The characters aren't at all interesting and fall into very specific archetypes. We have the British brainiac, the beefy badass, the happy-go-lucky childlike character, and of course the emo teen as the leader. To be fair, it is a Japanese title and the target demographic in their country is teenagers, so I can't really fault them for this, but I desperately hope that the characters go further than these simple archetypes in the final version. Luckily, with one of the demo's updates, they did give these characters a little more, well, character, giving us a peek into their interests by giving one-on-one side quests where you get to bond with your party members. While there's very little to work with and no real character development, I do have to reluctantly admit that I felt the cast had chemistry, and I'm interested in seeing how they get along in a full-length game. It has almost sold me on the whole road trip movie angle the developers keep stating they are aiming for, and I'm curious to see if it pans out. Well, there's no point in beating around the bush any longer here. Let's just dive into the most notable and controversial topic at hand when it comes to Final Fantasy XV, the combat. First and foremost, it's time that we have that discussion. The discussion of whether or not having real-time combat was a good choice. One side of the fanbase groans, Final Fantasy has always been turn-based and should stay that way, while the other equally stupid side argues, nuh-uh, games need to innovate, turn-based is dead and stupid, that's not how things happen in real life. Honestly, I debated making a video on this topic alone, discussing the growth and change of RPG combat from the NES era to the modern day, and while that may or may not happen, I will start off by touching on why both of these arguments are equally stupid. First off, it is true that mainline Final Fantasy games have always remained turn-based in some capacity, and honestly I do kind of wish it had stayed that way, but on the other hand, almost every Final Fantasy game has tried to do something unique with its gameplay and combat mechanics, with vastly varying levels of success of course. While it took me quite a while to begrudgingly accept that Final Fantasy XV would be action-oriented, it does seem to fit the type of game it is. Besides, let's face it, when it comes to the important people left at Square who are working on this game, none of them are talented enough to make a turn-based game interesting, and because of that I'd rather them play by their strengths and continue with the Kingdom Hearts-esque style that we know they can at least copy and paste efficiently. Now, for the other side of the fan base, saying turn-based games are no longer relevant is equally as stupid. Anyone who knows anything about trends in artistic mediums knows that things move in waves. The early 90s were all about platformers. The late 90s and early 2000s are when RPGs became king. Then it became the land of first-person shooters, and now it resides in the hell that is vastly bloated, open-world games with half-baked RPG mechanics shoved in even when they aren't warranted. However, the indie revival has caused a resurgence of platformer interest with games like Super Meat Boy, Fez, Braid, etc. Turn-based games aren't irrelevant. They're just in a down period, so to speak. There's obviously far more to this. Market interests, overblown AAA development costs which are hampering every aspect of the market, oversaturation, quality control, the argument that old RPGs were only turn-based because of hardware limitations as well. But once again, that's way too much to cover here. The most irritating thing for me when watching this debate happen is that neither side actually seems to understand the game designer series philosophy enough to know why this change in battle style matters, why it's a big deal, and why Final Fantasy XV's battle system, while intriguing, is a failure in terms of what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. Innovation is important, don't get me wrong, but there's a fine line between innovation and completely changing a core aspect of a series' gameplay, especially a series as long-running as Final Fantasy. This is not because the game's combat isn't turn-based, but because it completely disregards the most important aspect of every Final Fantasy game's combat to date: party dynamics. Now hold on, I can already hear those of you who played the demo shouting at the screen right now, saying something along the lines of, "There are party dynamics. Didn't you unlock any of the team attacks?" To which I respond, "These aren't party dynamics. They're poorly designed QuickTime events." When I say there are no party dynamics, I mean there's no team strategy. You can't command your teammates to tank while you prepare a spell. You can't have one party member focus on healing while the rest go all out. Oddly enough, the game that best used party dynamics with an automated set of teammates was Final Fantasy XII, where you could actually set parameters for your team to follow so they wouldn't be complete idiots. But even then you could take control of your teammates at any time to correct their behavior, or even disregard the gambit system altogether if you didn't feel like working with it. Final Fantasy XV at this point seems to offer nothing of the sort, not even a way to switch to another character so you can micromanage at that level. If the AI is stupid, you are stuck with it, and my experience with the demo shows that they are not at all that intelligent, which, given the game's focus on action, is even more depressing because all they have to do is keep attacking, and they can't even do that effectively. This is doubly surprising when I saw how well a similar combat system was implemented into Final Fantasy Type 0, which makes it doubly hilarious when you remember that this demo came packaged with said game. Hey, did you like Type 0? Well, here's a demo of a game with similar combat, but worse. The day they create AI that is competent enough to actually serve and feel like skilled fighters are with me is the day I won't care about this issue as much, but they are definitely not at that point yet. I know this will be blasphemous to a lot of you, but even Final Fantasy XIII, with all of its failings, understood that party dynamics were the key and central focus of what makes the series what it is. While I personally don't consider the paradigm system to have been a successful experiment, it is still far more true to what Final Fantasy combat is supposed to be than Final Fantasy XV is, and that is kinda pathetic. It's especially interesting that they would dismiss the party dynamics as this game's theme is camaraderie, and while they are willing to express that through dialogue, they clearly aren't willing to express it through gameplay. At least not effectively. Putting aside my frustration at Square's complete and utter disregard of the series' purpose, if I ignore my party and focus purely on critiquing the combat controls and the main character, they are serviceable. Your main means of attacking is holding down the X button, which pulls you into a combo that will play out on its own. There are some subtleties to the system, however, as the direction you push the analog stick in determines how the combo plays out. The skill comes from proper timing of your special attacks and balancing out their use with that of your regular combo and MP regeneration. There's also a parry system that can only get to work half the time despite how simple they are to execute, and an automatic dodge button just for good measure. For a game with an action combat system, it wasn't all that responsive. There were multiple moments where my attacks would miss because my character just wouldn't move fast enough, and other moments where I'd want to cancel a combo but couldn't. I suppose the latter issue may have been intentional, as it's near impossible to stop an attack mid-swing, but did lead to a lot of annoying instances of being stun-locked. So far, the only difficulty the combat truly has is the tried-and-true method of, if we sick enough monsters on you, then you won't have the chance to attack at all. That or one-hit kills from bosses, so in other words, no real genuine difficulty whatsoever. I'm giving the game the slight benefit of the doubt here, as there will be time to pace things out and actually create a gradual difficulty curve in a full-length RPG, while this demo uses its bosses for spectacle and nothing more. Overall, the system is functional, though underwhelming, and I obviously expect it to be expanded upon a great deal by the time they finally get to the final product, but there's definitely potential here. That is, if they can fix the issues I mentioned, as well as the terrible lock-on system which only works half the time and randomly disengages from whatever you were targeting. Oh, and as a bit of an aside, I want to ask one more thing here, real quick. People often complain about random battles because of the time they take to complete, but I can usually dispatch all the enemies in a random battle in less than a minute, while many fights on Final Fantasy XV's demo would last over 8 minutes simply because enemies were meat sponges and more soldiers would continually drop from above. Is that a good trade-off to you guys? I'm confused. Anyway, whatever, let's move along. Aside from the combat, there's not much to talk about in terms of gameplay. It plays out like any other open world game you've ever played. They hand you a map, a list of objectives, and tell you to start walking, making sure to force you to walk tediously back and forth over the same ground over and over again, with only a couple secrets strewn about the place. Given the current trend in the market, I'm a bit sick of the bloated mess these open world experiences tend to provide as opposed to a tight, well-paced narrative with purposefully placed gameplay between. To be fair, that isn't Final Fantasy XIV's fault as much as it's a fault with the industry and their poor attempts to combat used sales. But, once again, another issue for another time. All I really have left to say is that the final game better be a whole hell of a lot more polished than this. Even with Square's updates, I ran into a multitude of bugs in just a couple hours of playtime. Major and common frame rate drops, the camera getting stuck on corners and not performing properly on a number of occasions, my characters getting completely stuck when the Katapa boss came out of the water which forced me to reload the game, characters re-reacting to triggers and variables that have already been accomplished, multiple audio cues for dialogue occurring at the same time, making them overlap with each other, sometimes having the characters speak more than one line of dialogue simultaneously, combat mode ending while I'm still actively participating in combat. I mean, yes, I understand this is just a demo, but holy guys, you're giving Bethesda a run for their money here. If Square can't even polish 2 hours of gameplay with updates, how in the hell can we trust them to polish an entire 40-hour experience? Especially when they're unfamiliar with crafting open-world products to begin with. This does not bode well. So... that went on for quite a bit longer than I planned for it to. Luckily, I have far less to say about the Platinum demo, so let's just jump right in, shall we? The Platinum demo follows Child Noctis as he tries to escape his own nightmare with guidance from the series' famous summon, Carbuncle. Not gonna lie, I squeed a little. Once again, the demo looks beautiful, especially in terms of lighting. I was most blown away by the detail on the hardwood floor panels in the miniature section of the demo. The presentation hasn't changed much from the original demo. There are obviously all new locations, but the graphics remain the same level of quality and the frame rate is still an issue. They also toy around with weather effects, so... yay? I'm not really sure why this is still considered exciting or noteworthy. Weather effects have been in gaming for quite some time now, but whatever. The voice acting for Child Noctis is god-awful, but I doubt we'll be seeing a lot of him in the main game, so I'm not really concerned with it, and my feelings on the music remain the same as before. The two biggest changes to the gameplay are a completely new button layout and the ability to assign different weapons to different shortcuts so they can be easily switched to at will, potentially allowing for players to make their own combo attacks in the future. I don't really know if that's how it's actually going to work, as the combat was so watered down in this demo that I couldn't really tell you what their intentions were. That's right, oddly I found the combat to be a step down from the previous demo, only allowing for a short few hit combo with your sword and only a single hit with a hammer you can find in the game. It does let you toy around a bit with bomb weapons and magic for the first time, but that certainly doesn't make up for it. In terms of story, this decision makes sense, as Noctis is a child here instead of the teenage self he's represented as in the last demo and in the main game, which is fine, but does make me question the developers' priorities. You see, they're releasing a demo with the key intention of selling copies of their game, and while that is the purpose of every demo, this one makes its purpose even more clear by not only giving you the option to pre-purchase the game on the title screen, but by asking you once again at the end of the demo. The problem here is that if I knew nothing else about the game besides what I experienced in this demo, I wouldn't want to purchase the game. It is not at all representative of the final product. It doesn't even work as an interesting story lead-in. Most importantly of all, it definitely doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game. In fact, the game feels more like a platformer and a collectathon than it does an RPG, and I have to be honest, I'm not at all intrigued by that premise. I suppose it isn't that big of an issue, as I highly doubt that this type of gameplay will be in the main game. Once again, that makes the choice by the developers even more quizzical. Final Fantasy XV's Platinum demo is very clearly a tech demo, a test of functions that's been polished up and handed out to the players, and that just feels weird and half-assed to me. This is clearly seen with the creature and vehicle transformations you get by stepping on certain spots on the map, but serve absolutely no purpose that I could find. I don't really understand the logic behind it. If it wasn't already sold by Episode Duske, I would walk away completely from the game at this point. After playing both of these demos, I'm not really left hopeful or upset by them. More than anything, I'm honestly just intrigued. I'm curious to see what the final product will be like, and though I doubt it will be spectacular, I don't think it'll be awful either. I've resigned myself to the fact that Final Fantasy's given up on its roots a long time ago, so now I'm just morbidly curious and fascinated as to where it will end up in the long run. That is why it will be an inevitable purchase for me, because I'm fascinated by this transition in an almost scientific way and I want to be there studying it. If nothing else, the demos forced me to reflect on the series as a whole and my own mindset as a gamer and a fan. Is the Final Fantasy series actually getting worse, or am I just stuck in my ways? It's completely possible that a combination of getting older and more jaded is keeping me from fully enjoying what could actually be a decent experience. Perhaps I'm blinded by nostalgia, though that is something I often criticize when it comes to other people's views. I sat and mulled over these thoughts for quite some time, and to be perfectly honest, I couldn't come up with a fair answer. I tend to know my biases, is, but I could be wrong. With all these thoughts swirling in my head, I was led to only one logical solution to my problem. It's time to embark on an adventure. It's time for me to finally jump in on my dream project, the one thing I've wanted to do since I started writing video game reviews over 5 years ago. I'm going to start from the beginning to play through and review every Final Fantasy title, not just the main entries, but every English spin-off as well. I want to re-experience every peak and every valley in this storied series. Over 50 titles. Now this is obviously an enormous undertaking, and quite honestly it could take me a couple of years to get through it all. Not to mention the fact that I likely need a couple breaks here and there because that many RPGs back to back could destroy a person's psyche. While we're here, I'm going to lay down some ground rules for this synopsis so you all have an idea of what to expect. Number 1, I'll be playing what I consider to be the definitive version of each entry as I get to them, because I want to give each game in the series the best possible chance to wow me. Number 2, I am judging these games based upon how well they hold up today, not back when they were released, today. This is a problem I often run into when reviewing nostalgic video games, so I want to make it very clear here. This does not mean that I'll overlook the historical importance of certain entries, but it does mean that I'm going to do everything I possibly can to look past my own biases and the biases of the community to judge games on their own merits by today's standards. Obvious graphical and hardware limitations being the obvious exception. Number 3. I may or may not be doing all of the bonus content in the main entries depending on how much I'm enjoying the game at the time. While I'd like to do 100% runs of every single game, it just isn't feasible. I want to talk about said extra content as a means to make my critiques as all-encompassing as possible, but I do have to draw the line somewhere. Number 4. I'll be playing the mainline entries in order, but when I come to a game that has related story content or sequels such as the compilation of Final Fantasy VII or the Evil Eyes Alliance games, I'll be playing them all back to back in the relevant story order. I'll also be including a few spin-offs that aren't technically Final Fantasy games such as Air Gaze and Vagrant Story, just for the sake of completion. How I'll be handling other unrelated spin-offs such as the Chocobo Ties and the Crystal Chronicles sub-series? To be honest, that's yet to be decided. Finally, number 5. As I'm covering every Final Fantasy game, I'll also be covering the MMOs, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not really sure how I'm going to handle that yet. Obviously, they take far more time than even the longest of mainline single-player entries. I may have to do these titles out of order, or take some time off so I can power through the games as quickly as possible. I don't really know, I'll figure that out as I go along as well. If anyone has any questions, suggestions, or anything of the like, I'll be more than happy to reply to them in the comments or even make a follow-up video in the future. I do have a couple of loose ends I need to tie up before I can truly move on to this project, namely Quantic Dream, and one other mysterious video that has been in the works for some time. Sadly, Breath of Fire will be put on hold, but to be honest, I've gotten about halfway through Breath of Fire 3 by this point, and frankly, none of the games thus far have been able to hold my interest. Perhaps I can revisit it with a new outlook in the future. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and if you're interested in watching me struggle through the project that may one day kill me, please subscribe.